Welcome to the podcast. Today we're talking about resilience in electric buses. Just to set the context, EV buses require new technology, new processes. It's a real transformation for operators and councils running bus services. And all of that brings new risk. And there's a choice about how much you invest in de-risking that, or do you try and minimize the costs and deal with it yourself. So we're going to have a discussion about how operators and MCAs and councils can make bus services resilient, but in the right way and within budget. And I'm joined by three bus experts that are going to help me with the discussion. We've got David Leeder, CEO, previously CEO and MD, and multiple bus operators, including the West Midlands, First Bus UK and National Express Group. Alex Perry, previously director of MD at Arriva, First Group National Express, and Simon Cubitt from Verve, who runs our bus sector and electrification. Could I just start by asking for a better introduction and down? So just give us, David, a bit of your experience in the bus market before we get into the meat of the discussion.
Yes, so as you said, I've been running various bus and rail companies for a few decades. The last 10 years I've been advising on deals of bus companies, investments in electric bus economics. Really any deal involves electric buses these days. So we've looked at things in the UK, Scandinavia, Belgium, a whole range of places. And every single one involves electric bus operations and economics.
Yeah, great. Alex.
Hi, yes, so as you said, I've always worked in bus companies, bus operations mainly, worked for some of the big groups. And then in the last 6 or 7 years, been working in consultancy. I've been working more recently with the East Midlands Combined Authority and also down in the city of Bristol with the local authority there. And obviously the move to zero emissions and electric buses has been a big feature of a lot of what's been going on. People are starting to think forward, thinking ahead. Worked with David on several projects, as was mentioned, where we've been introducing electric buses and looking both at the economics, some of the practicalities. And it is a big change for people. Diesel buses have been around 60, 70, 80 years, perhaps very used to it, very predictable. Electric is something different, not to be scared of, but you need to think differently.
Yeah, excellent. The Simon, not least.
Well, you've done these guys a bit of a disservice by saying I'm an expert. So I've only been in the bus industry for about 2 or 3 years. I've been in the EV industry for about 7 years or so, which for a fairly fledgling industry is a reasonable amount of time. But my real expertise lies in customer relationship management. So I've been customer facing for nearly 22 years now. So the combination of those things, a small amount of bus industry experience, a meager amount of EV experience, and a lot of customer experience, all roll into my job as a commercial director for the bus and coach channel here. So my job is to go and speak to operators, councils, understand their requirements, and try and translate those requirements into services that they can deliver. So I've got a team of account managers, BDMs, analysts that help me to do that.
Yeah, great. So we're talking about resilience. Can I just start the conversation by talking about some of the design choices right at the start? So in the UK, some areas are franchising. So the combined mayor authorities are taking control of depots and routes, and are franchising these the operators. In doing that and considering electrification, what are some of the choices that you might want to consider when it comes to making sure that things are going to run as they need to? So for example, should they upgrade the site that exists today or build an SCU one that works?
I think that we should be quite clear the scale of the change is very, very large. And there are 2 or 3 changes going on at the same time. So in terms of scale of the change, when have we done this before? Before the First World War, we replaced horses on a mass scale with petrol vehicles, which was a fundamental change. In the 1930s and 50s, we replaced most of the trams with trolley buses or diesel buses. So it's that scale of change. And that was normally done at depot scale conversion. Now, just to make it more complicated, we're also fundamentally changing the regulation. And because we're changing the regulation, we're changing the responsibility. So it won't be a case of saying operator X has messed up on the implementation. It will be the newly elected mayor, probably funded with DFT capital grants. So I think that you really want to mitigate those risks. As Alex said, I think these are risks that we understand in more and more detail, but you are trying to do multiple things at once. And so if I was still running urban transport operators or or fleets of bus companies, large multi-site bus companies. Given that I've got all these other things going on, I would really want technical people to hold my hand. But they might be people that I employ, or they might be people that I buy in. And I think there's a particular kind of category of operator, which is the single site operator. And across Europe, I mean, most operators are single town, single city operators. They might have 1 or 5 depots. But what that means is they're not like London Transport in the 1930s, who were converting 30 depots from trams to trolley buses and doing it in a programme. They're going to do it once or 3 times over a small amount of time. So I think that technical expertise is really important, and it's also multi-dimensional. It's electrical engineering, it's electricity supply, it's acquiring assets. So this is complicated, but I mean, the good news is plenty of people have done it already, and we can learn from that.
And I think there's a lot of different elements to think about at the same time, and a lot of different types of business and companies. So it's easy to say, oh, you're a bus company. As David said, it might be one of the multi-sites in a big city. They may or may not be going down the franchising route. There's a lot of other places, and there's a lot of other small operators, for instance, who I've been doing some work with recently, and they've got some very different challenges. They often have quite small depots. Those depots might be leased. And if it's part of a partnership at the moment, there's not always any certainty of whether there'll still be a partnership or might it change to a franchise. So there's some very big and quite complicated decisions with big consequences too. And that's why I think the planning side of it and starting early is so important. You need a 15, 20, 30 year plan really to say what's going to be the best approach. So there's the transition and some of the technical challenges about that. But actually, what are you trying to achieve? A lot of bus garages have been there a real long time. Another, I think, fundamental challenge, is it better, perhaps in a franchised area, to stick to the garage that you've got? May well be in a good location, but is the power supply available? Or the physical layout might need to change. Can you actually do that? Or are you better off going to a new site that's specifically built for electric vehicles? And some of those things are huge questions, and I think the answer will be very different in different parts of the country. Yeah. So it's easy to say an operator or a location. There's so many different factors. That's why you need to think very carefully up front.
I mean, there are some things we could say in general terms about resilience, economic resilience. I mean, we know really overwhelmingly, I mean, what is the economic equation for a bus company? It's the cost of operation less the fare revenue. And any interruption to service will have a very large negative effect on the revenue. And it won't just be for the few days that the disruption occurred. I mean, if you look at the graph of London bus patronage, you can still see the 1956 bus strike. It was a permanent loss of patronage. We've got lots of examples like that. And the second issue is the cost hit. That if you have a plan and it's disrupted and you try and muddle your way through, that's invariably very costly. And then we've now introduced the new element of, let's call it, political resilience. The mayors having said, oh, this is a great idea, I'm now in charge. I think in general, they're not going to want to be in charge of a big mess up. So there will be great pressure to avoid the political consequences. But I mean, as Alex was saying, I think that one thing we can be quite clear is that the status of depots will have to be reconsidered. These depots are typically between like 30 and 130 years old. The one in Queen's Road in Manchester, I think, was 125 years old the other day. There's plenty more where that came from. And we've seen in some of the projects we worked in. So I think another consideration Alex was touching on is you basically say, do we persist with this? Do we give it one more lick of paint? Or is it now the time where we have to completely rebuild it or move to another site? Particularly if, we're not the owners of the site. Maybe we have a chance of buying a new site, but you still have to get the staff and the equipment from the old site to the new site. So this is quite complicated.
Another big equation there, isn't there? Often the bus garages are well sited. The biggest cost in a bus company is labour, and the more travelling time you pay in, the more expensive it gets. So although you might have a good city centre site, it might not be ideal from the state of the fabric and the electricity supply. Moving to often the outskirts of a town or a city imposes a lot of operational costs, and those costs are forever. Yeah. So it's a real trade-off situation as to the best location with all these different factors brought in. But it's not easy to find new sites. But again, if you're thinking ahead, you're thinking about the future, thinking about 10, 20, 30 years, that's the sort of conversations and thought process that you need to design it right. And then you can start building in some of the resilience. I think another area about the power side, and as David said, if you suffer and don't run the service, you get an immediate hit, but you've got years to recover. Political risks, PR risks, and revenue risks. Diesel's been around for a long time. We've gotten very used to it. It's very predictable. It's very easy to have a big tank of diesel, use what you need, keep it filled up and everything else.
We almost never run out of diesel unless there's a hole in the tank.
Well, yeah, a few good stories. But when I was down in Penzance, of all places, running the buses there, we got a phone call. The tank had gone a bit low, admittedly. However, the tanker never turned up. So all of a sudden, we've got a garage that's 20 miles plus from the nearest other site, and we faced no buses the following morning. We literally, believe it or not, went to the local supermarket, which was a Safeways, and we filled up the fleet there. It was so easy. Now, I don't know if we ever got the points for it, but anyway, it was easy to do. But that's a sort of a silly example, but it's so easy with diesel that we're all used to that you could find alternate sources if you needed to.
Yeah.
We'll go on to talk about some of the things about the electricity. It's a very simple product, diesel buses, and you've got to change your thinking.
Yeah.
We'll come on to that. But it is that thought process that's completely different, and you've got to have these conversations early on.
One thing we've seen in some of the emerging markets where we've looked at projects, and you may have seen in the UK, is the risk that the power is not on. And we're not used to in the UK the idea that there might be a power interruption, but there are places that we've looked where they have weekly power interruptions, and they've got to plan essentially battery buffer to get through that. I think there would be a shock in the UK if we have a power outage, but serious people think there are increased risks to that in the UK grid. So resilience has many dimensions. Maybe one that you haven't talked about is the technical staff, because we're also completely changing the technology. Some of the staff may decide that they love diesel and this is their catalyst to leave the business because they like repairing diesel equipment. The ones who remain certainly need to be retrained. So that's a whole area. If you have people to maintain the vehicles, you very quickly get into
the average age of engineers in the bus industry generally is at the higher end, sort of 50 plus. So are those people happy to retrain, or is it an opportunity to replace them and create some new jobs in more of a sort of high tech, highly trained way?
And it's a very different skills, very differing in software as well.
And if to be fair, if you spend 30 or 40 years doing certain jobs, to suddenly have all of that taken away and to go on some very high skilled laptop diagnostics, it's not for everyone.
And I mean, Alex and I both worked in the West Midlands, and people are incredibly parochial. So the business of moving the depot, even a mile, some will say, I don't want to go to this exotic place that is a mile away. I've worked my whole life in this specific place. And we've experienced that problem a lot. So actually saying, there's a nice new place down the road which has got a non-leaking roof and a nice canteen. That may be the prompt to say, can I have my numbers gaffer? Can I retire? So that is another real life problem. If you haven't been able to maintain the things, we're quickly in big trouble.
And the faster the rollout of electric buses, the more pressure on the number of skilled people that currently exist, because it's not something a 6-month course and you're suddenly skilled. It takes time to build that. So that's another resilience factor that you've got to be thinking now. What is the workforce? What's the workforce plan? And if it doesn't go to plan, what's my backup?
I guess one of the big differences is that they're no longer reliant on the couple of people that can fix the bus. Actually, to have a truly resilient bus depot as electric, you're relying on third parties, multiple operators. Can I just come to Simon for a second? I just wonder if you could maybe bring to life some of the differences between a diesel bus depot and electric one in terms of what are some of the things that can go wrong and the challenges that you face.
Correct. So picking up on the things that you both said, actually. So all depots are different, so to caveat with that. And also we'll talk buses, but you've talked a lot around power. Power's every answer you've given is involved power.
Yes.
And where that fits in terms of the resilience and planning is twofold. So there's planning for the depot to go live. So the initial work before to get in the high voltage power connection, get enough power to the depot, and then planning to have enough power for your operations. So there's quite a long lead time to get that power to the depot. So if you've ordered your buses, which take, say, 9 months, power connections can take many, many years. And what we've seen with less experienced operators, or potentially the combined authorities that are going to be going into more bus operations, is they tend to think vehicle first, get it ordered. Actually, the power's going to take 2 or 3 years to come to site. So what do you then do with those buses? Do you store them for 2 years? And there's costs, there's hassle with that. So there's that element to consider. And then, do you have enough power to run the depot with your operations being fully resilient? So, for example, you could get a lower power connection, which is cheaper, but that means you're going to have to be charging at that maximum connection headroom the entire time the buses are charging overnight. So if something goes wrong, there's very little backup. So
It's just happening now.
it's happening now, and that's one of the things we see where, again, all depots are different. So you might have one depot that's got, years ago they signed up to power very early, they got a cheap deal, and they managed to get a very high power connection. There's no load management that's needed, so I won't get too technical, but load management, it's basically reducing the speed of the charges, so if you turn them all on at the same time, they won't blow the power.
So it's rationing the electricity.
Ration the electricity. So if you've got plenty of power, you don't need to ration the electricity. But that's just not possible on some sites. So there are restrictions depending on where you are in the country, or even in the same area. You could be in one part of a town, and that you talked about a depot being a mile away. You might be a mile away, and the power situation could be very different. So in terms of how that will fit into your resilience, it matters on several levels. So if, for example, the charging software goes down and you lose comms, that charging software was managing within that power connection. So you don't want a safety issue. So when the power cut goes down, the chargers will automatically charge very, very slowly on a constrained site. On a site with plenty of power, they'll just continue. If there's no safety restriction, and the difference between those two scenarios is huge.
And the worst thing is that you run out of time to charge the bus to where it needs to be to get out to the reach that it is.
Yes, exactly. So and there's all manner of, and we can touch on this in more detail later on, but there's all sorts of things that can cause buses not to run. Power is just one of them, but power is typically the most challenging and the most expensive to resolve.
But and I said earlier on, we don't do this level of change very often. So many of these depots do go back that far. So many of the depots date back to when we replaced the horse buses or when we replaced the trams. So the rebuilding of the depot is an infrequent activity. But we're adding a further level of complication, which is we're adding power to the depot. And this is a project management task that most operators just haven't done. So if I was running bus operators faced with that, I would definitely want project management assistance. In other words, people who've done this before, but could also coordinate all the activities in the right order. Because, to repeat what we said earlier on, I've also got to deal with re-regulation. The number of passengers may be going down, new subsidy arrangements. I mean, there's only so many things that the management can deal with. So if you can find somebody who can actually help you do that, that is a massive de-risking. When I was involved in building Midland Metro, we had project management people do that. We didn't attempt to blunder our way through it on our own.
And there's so many different small operations that are only going to do it once. And, with the best will in the world, we don't want to keep having the same mistakes. So the more resource you can buy in, the skills and experience, the better. Quite simply.
I mean, there are many operators that have never rebuilt a depot in the memory of the people who run those companies, let alone added all these additional complications. And that is a very specialist activity. And of course, the new depot, or a heavily rebuilt depot, will be very different because of the electric vehicles. So this is if you map this out as a kind of project plan, this is going to be hundreds of activities. So that scale of, a Gantt chart that you need to muster something like this.
And the space that you need is straight away. We talk about a diesel bus is very simple. They pull onto the fuel pump, 3 to 5 minutes, finished, parked or forgotten or moved if you need to. Whereas with charging, it needs, even with fast charging, a period of time where it's stationary and plugged in often you lose 10, 15, possibly 20% of the parking space because each vehicle needs its own bay and its own connection. So that's just another complication and difficult to move around. You don't want to interrupt the charging overnight if you don't have to. So there's lots of other factors to plan in advance. And again, using people with that knowledge is crucial to getting it right. And if you get that bit wrong at the start, all these other resilience problems escalate and you'll never solve.
Yeah, I mean, we said that virtually everything changes, and what Alex is referring to is the whole flow of vehicles in and out of the depot is different. And again, those things have not really been questioned for many, many decades. Like the process of fueling and cleaning and parking a petrol or diesel bus is a 110-year-old understood process, and this is a new process. Probably, even if we go to depot conversion, there's probably going to be a period of sort of dual running of some kind needed, either both vehicles in the same depot or running two depots in parallel for a while, because you're going to need to, there's a rate of change we cope with, but there's also probably about staff. Staff are a very scarce resource, so we've got to make sure that we make them feel warm and welcome and get them over to the new place and the new working practices. So on operational scale, you won't be able to do it overnight, even if you are kind of going down the big bang route. It's never a complete overnight change. And anyone who does that, I think, is taking an extreme level of sort of reputational risk. To introduce new vehicles, new software, new premises, all on the same day. Well, that's an extremely sort of reputation damaging pathway to go down.
Yeah. And then let's go back to what you said at the start. Do you do a whole garage once, or do you do sort of routes or part of the garage at one time? And I guess there's not really a right or wrong answer for that. It depends on the circumstances and situation that we're in. I think overall it's probably easier, especially if you've got multi-sites in one city, to do a whole garage conversion. And I don't know if that's what you've been finding or not.
So there's always we're going to talk a lot today about trade-offs. So there's a benefit, I guess, to running a garage of both diesels and electrics on resilience, because if you're, for whatever reason, there's a power cut, which should be fairly unlikely, but if something goes wrong with the charge of the bus, you can't charge a number of buses, it's good to have the diesel backup. The trade-off to that is it's far more economic to do whole garage in one go.
Yes.
And you realise the benefits, not just because, as we say, you just dig the hole once, you have to come back again, you don't have to do multiple power applications, have team, have your operations disrupted at multiple times. You do it in one hit, and then you've got the economies of scale there as well. And you can remove some equipment to save space. So you don't need the diesel tanks, the AdBlue tanks, far less parts. And equally, you need less engineers typically, because there's not as much maintenance to do, at least on the buses. Maybe there are on the chargers, and the engineers could work better. But of course, the challenge is you're always going to be in a position with all types of resilience is it's the economic benefits versus the operational benefits, and where do you draw the line there? And there are no perfect solutions, just trade-offs.
And it seems to me that probably what we'll be doing is actually what London Transport was doing in their 30s conversions. So you're actually converting the depot in one go. In other words, you're adapting the depot, but then within that there will be quite a short envelope or not, on which you change the vehicles over. So that there wasn't an overnight. They converted the tram depots for trolley buses, but then they were running dual fleets for a period of weeks or months in any given depot. But the point being that the kind of structural works, power, etc., that was all done sort of once and planned once, and by people who'd done the previous, X depots. That feels like the way to go. I mean, there's also the one topic we haven't talked about. It's probably a separate podcast. Is who's providing the capital? Because you mentioned trade-offs. I mean, you've got to decide, do I do it that way? In many cases, the reason it's being done in small increments is those are the increments of capital that someone has provided, both the operators and the DFT. And the way that we've thought about it, you can see in the UK maybe crudely 3 cases. In London, the electric conversion is 100% privately financed, 0% DFT financed, but paid for by DFT. By TfL through the monthly payments to the operators. So that's case 1. Case 2 is Manchester, Liverpool, etc., where many of the vehicles have been 100% financed by the DFT, which is the world's best bank the bank of other people's money. 0% interest rate, 0% capital repayment. So I think that's an excellent bank. And then the third situation, which is the Portsmouth and similar places Zebra situation, we have this complicated 70% of the difference. But if you do a more simple maths that we've done on that, it's sort of 25%. So what do I mean is the diesel fleet would cost 100. The electric fleet pre-subsidy would be 200 per vehicle, like for like capital. And so 50 of 200, i.e. 25%, come from the DFT. So that then raises the question, how much money have I got from those two sources, the operator and its banks, or the DFT? And clearly, people have acted in a way that's constrained, I think, by finance, but also by their risk level. So, 10 years ago it was risky to do this. We'll try it with 5 or 10 vehicles. Now people are looking to do 30, 50, 100 vehicles, but the constraining number is capital.
Yeah.
And that is limiting it.
You also have to make the case to invest a bit more for redundancy and resilience.
Yes.
Previously, that was quite simple. So we'd have a couple of extra buses, but now it's much more complicated. So in terms of what redundancy looks like in an electric bus depot.
Yeah, I guess the challenge is if it's a large bus depot and say you've got 100 buses and you think, oh, I'll have some spare charges. If the whole depot goes down, you're never going to have 100 spare charges. That's an enormous amount of capital to deploy.
100% spare capital is not a sensible trade-off.
Yes, but you would rarely, if you do get power cuts, it's generally the people who look after the grid will typically fix it really quickly. So it's not that likely to happen. It's always the worst case scenario people go to. But if you think about your normal day in the office at work, and you're on your PC, how often do you have a full power cut that interrupts you? Probably not that often. But you'll have hardware issues, software issues, Wi-Fi issues. Those are absolutely kind of the niggly little issues that will put a number of buses out. And that's the bit you can try and put some resilience measures against to protect against those things. Whereas if you've got 100% EV depot and the power goes down, you're kind of stuck to a degree, unless you can do something a bit more progressive, whereby bus operators in the same area, even if they're competitors, can say, well, we'll share the capacity between us. We're electrifying bus depots, but also electrifying truck fleets as well. So maybe there's a truck depot nearby. So there are other ways potentially people want to work together, and maybe franchising would help that, because they're in control of all the depots in one region, and they don't mind trading between them.
Yeah, where there could be more coordination, and also if more facilities are being transferred at the same time, that gives that a little bit of extra fallback position and a bit more resilience. And I think that is, a fair point, that it's being done on a wider basis, or maybe even a region basis, rather than pockets.
Yeah, I think in the UK this has been extremely rare for a long time. Really, living memory, it's not been normal to have power outages that aren't associated with somebody digging through the cables or some flood or something very random event. But so you've met people. It's our sort of, let's call it, east of the EU type advisory work, where we said, how often do you have a power cut? And so it's 2 or 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And so those kind of places are going to have to plan for static batteries in the depots. I think there's another whole topic which is, kind of lying behind this, is just how is the power generated and where is it stored? Which again, at the moment, is not too pressing in the UK, because these are in aggregate small amounts of vehicles. But the plan is to remove internal combustion engines from all vehicles. And my understanding is you'd have to basically double UK power production. So we're trying to get, of the current, power production and stuff, 40%, I think, renewables, 60% non-renewables. So you need 100. We need to double that again. So we're not trying to go from sort of 40 to 100. We're trying to go from 40 to 200. So that's another whole lot of things that will manifest themselves, because batteries were a big part of the system.
Yeah, and there are some things that bus operators and MCAs can do. They can spend more money and more capital on things like batteries, or Starlink comms, or whatever it is that gives them a backup, or maybe a better confidence of running. But it's going to cost money. In your experience of advising organisations, how do you make the case for spending a bit more for something that is more guaranteed to work? That's a hard argument.
I think it is difficult. And again, at the moment, traditionally, I think that the vehicle has a certain mileage to operate, and there's issues around the range, but once that's there, typically it runs in the day, comes in the evening, it'll charge up overnight, and often the electricity is all perceived to be cheaper overnight, and then the bus is out and stays out all day. Well, actually in the future that might not be the case, and there might be more charging during the day, which will probably mean a bigger fleet with more spare capacity. That's then another trade-off, isn't it, about the cost of the power, the cost of the vehicles, and the sort of driver situation and changeovers too. So again, we tend to think of it in a certain way because that's how it works at the moment. But if there is a lot of solar power generated, maybe more so than is needed during the day, peak and off peak might suddenly change, or might change over a period of time. So that is, again, is a very, very different way of thinking. And it's a little bit more unpredictable, which makes the risk of change a little bit higher.
I mean, just to sort of elaborate that, I mean, we tend to think on buses and railways in terms of what we call like kind of engineering spares and hop spares. So the engineering spares, hopefully somebody is oiling them or adjusting them with a spanner or whatever engineering consists of. And the hot spares are hopefully in running order and they're there for the service going wrong. So we've tended to think in the analysis we've done of the idea of a charging spare and to explicitly work that out. But I think the other thing that comes out of what Alex was saying is that what is the energy storage strategy? So as we have more renewables in the grid, we need more batteries somewhere. And I think we've begun to realise that essentially the buses are part of the grid backup. So in the UK, I think what we're seeing typically is that there's an excess of power at night, which is essentially coming from nuclear and wind. There's no solar at night. I always like to remind people. If Ed Miliband is listening, I hope he's making notes on this. And then so what you're doing is you're storing, instead of putting that power in a grid battery, you're putting it in a big bus battery and discharging it during the day. In some of the places we've looked at in the Middle East, for example, there's an excess of solar. So that it may be appropriate for them to have a bus with a smaller battery and charge at route ends. They'll still need some batteries for their nighttime demand. Now, what are the implications of that? One that may be very unfashionable. You actually want, I think, price signals in the electricity network. The government for several decades, and particularly this government, has been moving away from that. But we actually want to know what the price of electricity is sort of minute by minute, because that way we can then make informed decisions reflecting price signals. But if someone says it's all too complicated and we should average the price of electricity, we will actually make this problem worse, because the purpose of the price signals is to encourage efficient investment decisions and behaviour. And you could imagine, it may not be the case to do the analysis, but you would expect the answer for a fleet of electric buses in, say, Morocco to be different than Aberdeen, because the electricity grid will be different. And where do you have the batteries will be different.
So energy is a really good example. It's quite a complicated area, and bus operators maybe, but local authorities, MCAs don't always have that capability in-house.
Absolutely.
What would your advice be to them in terms of how much of that should they build in-house, how much they lean on external experts to fit plastics?
I think generally you should follow the specialist advice.
Yes.
And this is a very specialist subject. We tinkered at the edges, but don't pretend to understand it in detail. And I think
what we understand is very complicated. I mean, we've learned enough about it to know that we don't know very much about it. But I think there's a lot of people, I think a lot of politicians sort of imagine that all these electric buses are powered by renewables in some vague way. Because most people have not thought about the grid. I mean, why should they? They've got other better things to do than worry about this. But I just don't see that even quite large operators would have the in-house expertise. I mean, some of the biggest ones, again, there are historical examples, they may actually generate their own electricity. I mean, there was an operator in Northern Ireland that had 100% renewable electricity generation in 1883. So this is not new technology. Lots of people had batteries in the 1890s. So none of this is new, but this has not typically been anything we've worried about since the 1940s when electricity was nationalised. Some of the transport operators, of course, were owned by electricity companies. So that was Balfour Beatty had a big bus and tramway business. So this has all been lost. I don't think any UK operators have got deep understanding of this.
And it's an area where you could easily waste money. and not get the best deals, not really understand some of the pricing choices that are being made. Money's tight in any circumstance. Public money is very tight at the moment. We've got to make sure what is spent wisely. And again, maybe in some of the franchising areas that we've been talking about, there's opportunities there where one body, instead of several operators, one body is essentially buying the fuel and the electricity costs, and they might be able to, make it a better use and get a better value from it. And that's going to be in everyone's interest.
There are both renewable generators and battery storage operators who are also looking at, through the other end of the telescope, they're also looking for business opportunity. And they may be prepared to do these sort of merchant deals with operators to cut the grid out because they're trying to protect themselves from fluctuations in the grid, government subsidy policy, and that's been a problem in the last 6 months where the government's abruptly changed the indexation from RPI to CPI and this kind of thing. So this is all very interesting. I think it's typically beyond the experience of an uninformed operator. So somebody who can help them through that process, I think, adding an enormous amount of value. Because to repeat, they've also got to deal with re-regulation. They may have to be rebidding all their contracts. They may get out of business. If they don't survive, a single site operator in the UK faces a survival risk. I mean, we are seeing it around the country now. Small operators in Manchester were basically obliterated. Some major operators in Merseyside haven't won any contracts. So it's completely existential for them. So do they really want to be working out, the best battery storage supply while they're doing all that? They haven't got time for that.
Yeah, and the small companies that, generally in the bus market have performed very well. They're least best placed to deal with any of this, but they're an important part of the market and we don't want to lose them. And ultimately, if a lot of the small operators disappear, then there's going to be less competition in the market. Even in the franchised areas, there's less bids and prices tend to go up. So there's quite an issue for small companies, and we were talking earlier a little bit about how you deal with that. Often they're in leased premises, so a 10, 20, 30-year horizon isn't practical for some of those. Maybe there's an opportunity for sharing of depots, and maybe the ads in some of the franchising areas is to actually share the depot. So all the infrastructure's put in. That's also helped spread some of the risk and makes a more resilient sort of supply chain to be able to do that. But that again is a bit of a change in thinking from where we've been in the past. It tends to be one operator and one garage. It doesn't have to be.
But if the risk of being thrown out of the podcast, the average passenger doesn't care whether the bus is diesel or electric. This is probably a plus or minus 1% thing. So if we look at the performance of operators in retaining and developing their passengers, very often the small ones are the best performers. Now, why is that? They're much more focused on specific routes, specific corridors, and this applies to the municipal medium-sized operators and the very small ones. And it doesn't just apply in the UK. It's a kind of global phenomenon. So I think there are very compelling reasons to have these very focused local companies. It would be very foolish to throw them away. And their expertise at running the services is a much bigger factor than whether the bus is electric or diesel. We've got to go on to electric, and there are some benefits to passengers, but they're not orders of magnitude effects like traffic congestion and bus frequency, which is probably a 10 times greater factor. So to throw away all that expertise because we couldn't manage the energy transition, that would be a big loss, in my opinion, to lose those smaller operators.
Yeah. And maybe that's the role of the MCA in franchise areas is making sure that all these different operators work together and maybe share the deal.
There are a few examples in London, aren't there, where people do share garages. It's not unknown, but it isn't common. And again, we're changing thinking, we're changing the way we're working. We're trying to think about building resilience in. The more we can do in advance, the better.
I mean, we must be wary of being too logical, because a lot of things in transport are either driven by illogical, what we've always done, or some historical reason, or maybe it was once logical, but we carried on doing it. So in Germany, where I've run buses, it's quite common for people to share depots or to run to other people's depots. But in the UK, culturally, this is seen as being a big failure to share depots. there are only a small number of examples, mainly in London at the moment. There have been a few more in the past. But I mean, I think that is basically cultural and needs to be challenged. It's not the end of the world, if Go Ahead and Stagecoach share a depot, or Fred's coaches, share a depot with someone else's coaches. But that does require a bit of a cultural leap. Now, you talked about trade-offs. I think if it reveals itself in a price advantage, people might say, well, I prefer to have my own depot, but if it's 30% cheaper to share a depot, maybe no, I sort of bury the hatchet and do something more pragmatic. But I think the other thing that we just touched on that we should really mark up, I think most people think that the integrated transport benefits, that's to say like common route numbering, inter-operator ticketing, that's all a good idea. I think we all agree with that. That's more than a 1% effect. That might be a 7 or 8% effect, but it's not a 50 or 100% effect. So we should do it. We shouldn't delude ourselves that it's going to transform demand in the long term. But I think my point is you can do that integrated transport without having a single operator. So we have to avoid going down the road of saying we need a single operator just to do that or just to do electric vehicles.
It's a big transition, but it is once. And then the market carry on, bus passengers, bus needs, all carry on. But it's quite a big challenge for people to go from what they're used to electric. And during that transition, make sure as best as you possibly can that there's no disruptions to the service.
Yeah. So one final question, if I may, before we wrap up, is we covered a lot of ground. We talked about the scale of the change, the sort of once in a generation, multi-generational change. Talked about how different electric bus depots are to diesel when it comes to redundancy and backups. What's the sort of one piece of advice you might give? I'm thinking about councils and MCAs mainly, for operators too, when they're looking at planning to move to electric for their depots or their networks, and they want to make sure they run on time and then they pick people up at the right time and they're resilient. What's the one piece of advice that you would give them if they're in the planning stage?
You don't generally want to be a technological outlier or pioneer. So my advice would be, ally yourself with someone or some group of people who've done it before.
And I think I'd only add to that, I think you've got to start the planning now. It's easy. There's a lot of challenges and there's some uncertainty. So it's quite easy to say, well, we'll come back to that. We know we've got to transfer to electric. We'll do it later. There's never a better time than now to make the start. You can always adapt the plan as the technology maybe changes. But these are some pretty fundamental decisions. Millions of pounds at stake. And you've got to make sure that all of that money is well spent. And the thinking is quite difficult. Use people that know about it and have got the experience to help you plan so that every pound you spend is a pound invested, not waste.
Yeah, we haven't seen a single implementation in any country where the supply of the power to the depot wasn't the biggest and slowest issue and the most uncertain cost item.
Simon, any final thoughts from you?
Well, you were saying do if people have done it before. Completely agree with that. You talked about planning, and I would say put those two things together and look at resilience in a couple of ways. So first of all, what are the issues, and what's the long list of all the things that could stop buses running? And that is between operators, electrification experts, and others, MCAs. That should be done together, and there'll always be an area that one person thinks of that or has had experiences in that someone else hasn't. So think of that big long list. And then think of how do you avoid or mitigate those issues. And again, everyone around the table will have different experiences from that. And then finally, you're not going to be able to avoid all risk and mitigate all risk. Something will go wrong. That whether it's a huge issue or a small issue, something is going to go wrong, and probably fairly regularly on a large network. So one thing that customers push me on is what's the plan B? So something will go wrong, and that's where you really need to work as an operator like us, or an electrification expert like us. You need to work with bus operators and local authorities around, well, you've been running buses for 10, 20, 30 years. You must have had issues before where buses aren't running. You must have contingency plans. How do we work together with you to tie into those plans so they know what to do? So operators know what to do if buses have an issue, and we can highlight various areas of resilience to help them. and we can then tie in wider companies to that. So I mentioned before around, we might have other customers, the logistics of a bus operators. If you could combine resiliency measures, you could have generators that you share between you, so in a common area. So there are lots of things you can do, but my overall advice would be it's all about partnership and working together to understand who can help mitigate the issues and who can help solve them when they do happen.
Great. So I think that brings us to a close. Thank you very much for the insights. We've gone from horse-drawn carts to nuclear-powered bus depots, so I think we've covered the full gamut. Really interesting conversation. Thank you, and join us next time.